Hi, Steve Hayes here, and welcome to Days Are Getting Better. In today's episode, I'm going to have a look at a few things that are happening in my world. A recent major article on the processes of change that are revealed by successful mediational analyses in randomized controlled trials of psychological interventions. The blog that's in my newsletter this time around walks through a little bit of that. And I'll attach the article and a link that is effective for the next few weeks to get the actual article for free out of the journal. I also want to talk about the process-based therapy or process-based approach think tank that we held at the university in Marburg, Philipps University there, under the direction of my friend and colleague, Stefan Hoffmann. And what the community of about 30 people came to over a 3-day period. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening with the app that I've been discussing that is designed to do high-density longitudinal measures and to be able to dial in a empirical case conceptualization using what we're calling idionomic statistics. And I'll mention a couple things of what's happening in our idionomic analyses and the clinical work that we're doing. So that's our agenda for today. And just let me begin with the so-called Death Star study. This study we've been working on since the end of 2017, and we as myself, Stefan Hoffmann, Joe Soroci, Australian Catholic University, at the Boston University and the University of Marburg in Germany, and our colleagues, Baljinder Sadra at ACU, and my student and soon to be most recent graduate, Fred Chin, who's on an internship. This massive review is now out in Behavior Research and Therapy. It's part of an invited article that walks through the history of ACT and how that might inform process-based therapy, because there's some features of ACT development that I argue really could be quite useful to us clinically. And it's pretty geeky, and so if you're a layperson, it may not be for you, but you can pretty much get through it and get the bottom line. And if you're a psychologist or mental health person, you definitely want to check it out in the newsletter. What we did over that almost 5-year period, it took 3.5 years of intense work, 2018 to now, and analysis and writing. We looked at every single randomized trial ever done on any psychological intervention ever used on any mental health problem with any method other than medications, and with a treatment as usual or no treatment control. We went that last because we were looking at whether or not a successful mediational analysis was found. In other words, an answer to the question of why does therapy work, not just does it work, using mediational statistics, which essentially look at whether or not the treatment differentially moved in a proximal way, something that's thought to be an important mechanism of change, and whether that controlling for treatment, which means basically that it it's true both in the control group and in the intervention group. So it's not just a marker of which group you're in or learning the lingo of your therapist. That predicts long-term outcome. And when you account for that pathway, that functionally important pathway significantly reduces the relationship of treatment to outcome. So looking at about 55,000 studies twice, took about 50 students almost 3 years to do this. I think if in hindsight, if we look back, we could have had some efficiency, probably could have done it twice as fast, but it was massive. And then we got in and really dialed in, looked at the statistics carefully and so forth, and threw out the ones that weren't properly done. We ended up with a little under, as I recall, 700 findings. And then we looked at the ones that have been replicated, because there was a lot of mediational measures that had one item from here, one item from there, et cetera. And it really, if it's never been replicated, you don't know if people are just, p-hacking afterwards, grabbing at anything. Because mediational analyses are often not the focus of the treatment work. We found 73 measures that have been replicated at least once, and they were there in 281 findings. We eliminated the ones that were outcomes. We're not looking at the impact of anxiety and depression or things like that. And we summarized the whole thing, and I can give you, drum roll, bottom line, which is surprisingly, in terms of the most frequently found significant mediators in relatively well-done mediational analyses in the history of the world, psychological flexibility and mindfulness accounts for just a little bit under 45% of those findings. I think people would be surprised by that, because ACT is the new kid on the block, not exactly mainstream until quite recently. But psychological flexibility, including mindfulness, works as a pretty good mediator, not just for ACT, but for a range of psychological interventions. And if you added the really friendly ones, if you added in things like self-compassion, which correlates something like 0.75 with psychological flexibility, or anxiety sensitivity, an old concept in CBT, but one that has a feeling of, greater openness and acceptance of emotions, looking at whether or not people are judging and running from anxiety, a behavioral activation, and so on. If you just take the ones that are really pretty clearly decentering, pretty clearly close to psychological flexibility concepts, you end up with 55% of everything we know. If you get a little more friendly beyond that, and you start looking at things like reappraisal, and realizing that actually reappraisal is itself often mediated by cognitive flexibility, diffusion, things like that, you can get up into the 80 and 90%. I'm not going to do that here, but I'll refer you to the article and just say, look, when we take a more process-based approach, which we've been trying to do in process-based therapy, which is not a new therapy, but a new way of thinking about therapy. Say new way, we've been doing it right along, but explicating it and writing about it that way. When you do that, it turns out that maybe all of that complexity that's out there with syndromes and sub-syndromes and positive goals and behavioral health, and on it goes, that maybe we can actually simplify that quite a bit. And we've been trying to do that with the extended evolutionary meta model of process-based therapy, and it looks like that's working. If you look at that article, you'll see that we're able to place the items from virtually all of the self-reports, and not all of it was self-report. Some of it was things like breath holding and behavioral measures, but you could place virtually all of them readily in a model that looked at variation, selection, retention, and context of the dimensions and levels of a biopsychosocial model. We brought together the crew in early June of folks who are really pushing out the edges of process-based therapy. And we were there for 3 days at the University of, there in Marburg. Wonderful, delightful little mountain town, not too far from Frankfurt. And it looks like something right out of a Harry Potter movie. Literally the buildings and stuff could easily be a set for Hogwarts. A charming place. And we were able to make, I think, some major progress. A few things I'll mention. people came towards the end of saying, maybe we should have been calling it a process-based approach and not just process-based therapy, because despite the fact we've said all along it's not a new form of therapy, people still think it is. And so people were talking about PBA as much as PBT towards the end of the 3-day meeting. And systems of care there in Germany and other places that were part of we're really excited to think about how we might individually now target the particular needs of clients instead of these one-size-fits-all protocols focused on these grotesquely simplifying normative categories called syndromes. I myself think PBA is fine. I kind of like that. I do wish it wasn't a synonym also for the Professional Bowlers Association, but we'll try to work that out. But the spirit of it is that, look, you're going to have to populate the extended evolutionary meta model with a model. It's not a model in itself, it's a meta model. You're going to have to come up with techniques and methods. You can be more open. You can, use the things that target the key processes that this client has. And that's not vapid eclecticism. It's not, all that everybody who's been playing should win prizes. It's also not model free. You still have to be able to get in there, whether it's a psychoanalytic model, an ACT model, a traditional CBT model, and so forth. You can soften the edges. You can look more broadly, but you do have to have a clear set of philosophical assumptions and a theoretical model to be able to do PBT. And so the PBA phrase maybe does that even more. I was surprised and pleased by the end of the 3-day meeting to see that people were really settling in on the idea of some kind of high-density longitudinal measures, an app, or other ways. As you may know, if you've been following my work, the process-based assessment tool, GIMI, as a new form of high-density longitudinal analysis, what we're calling idionomic analyses. In other words, analyses that are based on variability within the person over time, and then and only then clustering people into groups and subgroups only if they improve the precision of the degree to which we can model the individual. That's what we mean by idionomic. It's a word we had to make up as kind of a substitute for the word normal, which has dominated our thinking for the last 150 years. And I think people are really beginning to see how important this might be. An exciting thing since the think tank, even when the think tank came down and said, we really need that app, we need those measures, is that we've decided to take the app that we've been working on to do idionomic analyses using the process-based assessment tool, the PsycFlex measure, and outcomes like those that came out of the STOP-D trial, distress over sadness, distress over anxiety, and so on. As we focus on this, we're finding that it really does help categorize or analyze or unpack individual human beings. I'm getting more and more confident that this idionomic approach is going to give us new and important findings focused on the individual. The group iterative multi-model estimation method, GIMI, Peter Molinar and Katie Gates method. Katie's part of our development team for the app that the Institute for Better Health that I'm president of will hopefully third quarter put out. When we decided, that after the think tank that really we needed this, boy, we've decided to push the hammer down and get this thing done as fast as we can. And we have a board meeting coming up where we're going to spend a significant amount of the resources we have to try to put this in people's hands. But what we're finding is that it really does a pretty good job of characterizing individuals, number one. And that once you understand the spirit of looking at the individual and not turning them into an error term, where every voice matters, we're developing brand new analytic methods by simply taking statistical methods that have been used in group comparison approaches and dialing them down and saying, restricting the information that the methods have to within-person variability, and then looking at whether or not that helps us in kind of a sorting or categorizing way of bringing people together. Let me land this in a way that's a little more practical. If you're not a scientist, not a geek, I know I'm talking kind of geeky way. One of the things that I said to the think tank is, let us cross our fingers that people can get messed up only in a limited number of ways. If it's unlimited, if every single person is their own psychology, we're not going to be able to solve that problem. But we simply can't continue to live inside this delusion that when you say major depression, you're talking about something. You've heard me mention before, then the START-E trial, 3,700 persons with supposedly major depression, over 1,000 different combinations of signs and symptoms. And almost the majority had a combination that was so rare, it was shared with only 1/100% of the whole group. You know, that's not real. That's just not a real category. That's not a real label. That's not a real thing. That's delusion. So what we're finding is, yes, the individual matters, but no, people are not entirely unique. They're like others. And so cross your fingers, but maybe we will really begin to end up with idiographically determined clusters that will tell us more about what to do in treatment. One of the things I hope this app will do is, in a sense, answer the question of, why do I have such a difficulty in life? And I want to mention one thing. I'm going to be at the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference in Florida this coming December. And if you want to get on stage with me and work for half an hour, 40 minutes on your particular issues in front of a group, and are willing to spend the month or so before then, at least a month, using the app, I'm very interested in talking to you. So reach out to me, because I'm going to, in a way that is rolling the dice, because I won't know what shows up until people walk on stage, I'm going to try to do an idionomic assessment using these tools, and we'll get together and sort of do a reveal on stage and see if we can do some powerful work right then and there. I want to mention that, and now that the word conference came up, that with the end of COVID, I'm getting back on the road. I'll be doing a ACT boot camp there in the Bay Area at the end of September, beginning of October, and I'll be doing ACT for behavior analysts here in Reno I'm pretty sure it's late November. I'll put the date in my newsletter. So if you are wanting to get next to actual human beings that you can see and touch and hug and talk to, me too. And I'm very glad to have you come on down to these workshops that are organized by Praxis. If you go to www.praxiscet for continuing education and training, praxiscet.com, you can see what's coming up with the in-person events that I have on my schedule. Another thing that I think, kind of a final thing that I'd like to mention, is that we're now heading into an era where a lot of our concepts are going to have to be rethought. And so, fair warning, I just want people to know there's a little bit of a scientific storm coming. And process-based therapy is bringing us there. I'm not going to do a full impact on that. I wanted to keep this to about a 20-minute video, and I'm close to that now. But let me just give you an example of some work that Joe Sorochi, myself, Andrew Gloucester, others have been working on just in the last few weeks. You take something like self-compassion. It correlates pretty well, as I mentioned earlier, with psychological flexibility, and it correlates pretty well with compassion towards others. Not hugely, but significantly. When we start looking at that process in an individual way, without turning people into error terms, taking each individual as the world of themselves before we combine people, we see something different. We see that most people, that's true, the more compassion you have for yourself, the more for others. There's a few people, it's about 1 out of 5, where it's kind of in the middle. And then there's about 1 out of 5 where reliably, statistically, truly, within the individual, the more compassion the person has for themselves, the less they have for others. We're seeing this over and over when we take concepts that have been vetted at this group level, and I'm sure the day is coming when that will include some psychological flexibility concepts. So gang, be ready for your own favorite ox to be gored. I know my day in the tank is coming, but it's okay because we're pushing the ball down the road. This is going to be good for human beings. But when you do that, you find that indeed some of these models that we've got so used to that exist at the level of the collective are going to have to now be modified to be looked at the level of the individual. And when we find that there's a lot of variability there, we're going to have to put a little asterisk and say, we better figure that subtype out so that you, the practitioner, or you, the individual reading a self-help book, let's say, will know not simply to drink the Kool-Aid and say the book says this, the group statistics say this, and necessarily it applies to me. No, it may not. Or it applies to that client. No, it may not. Right now, it's just a cautionary note. But the apps are coming. The statistics are coming. The analyses are coming. The model, I think this extended evolutionary model, is already in place that works really, really well. Look at that article that's in the blog that I post here. And in all of that, I think it's time now to begin to adjust our concepts to apply to people at the level at which we actually deliver services, whether that's an individual, couple, or family, and not in this abstraction of the collective. A collective never walks into our door and asks for help. And no human being should be turned into an error term. I hope this is useful to you. Sorry for going a little bit geeky, but I want you to know what's coming, what's ahead. And the thing that's really waking me up in the middle of the night and early in the morning and get me in front of this machine I'm talking to with joyful hope that we can learn more about how to serve. Peace, love, and life, my friends.